Okay, so the title of my thesis is Understanding Young People's Experiences of a Managed Move. So this first quote here I put in because it's quite reflective of some of the experiences that the young people shared with me about the kind of chaos and upheaval that a managed move kind of caused them. So, oh, sorry. Okay. So just going a little bit into what we know already about managed moves. So they were introduced in 2004 by the Labour government, and they were kind of posed as a positive alternative to a permanent exclusion. So the current statutory guidance outlines that a managed move is where a pupil can transfer to another school as part of a managed move, where this occurs within the consent of the parties involved, including the parents and the admission authority for the new school. So the aim of a managed move is really on encouraging collaborative problem solving between the school, child and young person and their families. And the key difference between a managed move and an exclusion is that it should be a voluntary agreement between all parties. So that is, you know, hoping that it will then enable a pupil to have a fresh start and begin somewhere without the attached stigma and adverse outcomes associated with a permanent exclusion. So Masetta and Sonny conducted a systematic review looking at the research on managed moves in the UK, and they found 9 studies that they brought together under common themes which reflected what supported successful reintegration, so factors that supported that. They also found that research had highlighted difficulties with managed move, and Bagley, who was one of the main people to do research in this area, had also looked at some of the impact of the move. But this research had been conducted with people that have been through the managed move experience, so interviewing participants retrospectively about what the process was like for them, so sometimes 1 year after the move had taken place. And most of the interviews had also occurred with people whose move had been successful. So there's a paucity of research which exists exploring young people's experiences of the process as it changes and unfolds over time. So the current study used the person, process, context, time model to consider pupils' managed move experiences with a focus on the features of the move and how these interact with the individual over time. So my research questions, the first one was, how is the journey of a managed move experienced by young people? And the other one is, what are the main features of the managed move process that impact on young people's education? So my methodology, just to talk quite quickly through this, there were 5 young people who were recruited through the PRU. So in the local authority where the research took place, as part of the managed move process, people go through the PRU as part of the process. So they have an interim placement for 6 to 8 weeks, often much longer, at the pupil referral unit in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. But my participants were all Key Stage 4 pupils. And semi-structured interviews took place, and they occurred at multiple time points across the young people's managed move journey over a 9-month period. So as you can see there was, you know, different numbers of interviews that took place, in part due to some of the difficulties in sustaining that contact with young people, highlighting some of the challenges in terms of that engagement over time. And some of the young people, you know, didn't want to continue to engage or had different reasons why things weren't working out well for them in terms of continuing. But there was still a real sense of kind of getting to know some of the pupils over time and how their experience unfolded. And I used the life grid approach to elicit pupils' managed move stories. So we continuously kind of came back to that life grid and kind of added to it over time. And a developmental approach was used to member checking, whereby each time I met with the young people, I'd come back and go through their transcripts and highlight the key themes that I'd pulled out of their data, and we'd kind of go through that together. I also interviewed 5 adults who had varying roles in the managed move process. So that included a reintegration lead, the induction coordinator, a mainstream head of year who took on a role within the managed move process, a key worker, and the Senko. And I used a narrative thematic approach to explore the pupil stories of the managed move process. So looking at their story that they told over time. And I also did an additional thematic analysis on the pupil and adult data. So I'm just going to really quickly talk through the different phases of the manage move process. I've just chosen a couple of the different areas of the process to hone in on because I don't have time to go through all of the different phases. But I structured my findings into phases because there were quite a lot of commonalities in the pupils' storied accounts. So at first there were kind of within the earlier phases that shared many more commonalities, and then the stories started to diverge as the pupils kind of continued along their journey. So I'm just going to focus on a few of those significant areas in the process. But just quickly talking through school life before the move, this was where kind of the process of disengagement occurred in the transition from secondary school. And similar to Juliet's research, actually, there was all of the young people talked about the use of exclusion rooms there and their ineffectiveness at that stage. And then when pupils were heading towards the move, lots of them documented that as something that was related to a build-up of incidents over time, really similar to some of the persistent disruptive behaviours, which we know is one of the most common reasons for an exclusion. So some real similarities there in how young people spoke about that. And then in terms of the transition into the PRU, pupils had different experiences about how that process went for them, but all of them experienced a lot of confusion around that time about, what a managed move was and how that process was taking place, and the information that they received was very minimal. And pupils often talked about being on the periphery of meetings that were discussing the move, and sometimes sat, directly outside the room where the meeting was occurring. And you can see here in terms of people's quotes, I had no say in it whatsoever, and not recognizing what or understanding what a managed move was. So one of the pupils also highlighted how it was a real significant thing for him to leave behind a school that he'd been at for his whole life and all of his friendships and relationships that he'd built up. So the significance of that transition into the PRU really stood out. So that was within the transition into the PRU phase. And then the period of re-establishment that took place was when all of them were in the PRU, and a lot of them had positive experiences in terms of the additional support that they received. But there also started to be emerging concerns regarding, impact on their academic achievements and in terms of, taking on different subjects within the PRU to what they'd been doing previously. So some emerging concerns did start to appear within that phase. And then going on to the decision to reintegrate. So over time, people spoke about their decisions around whether they were going to stay in the PRU and complete their managed move there, or whether they wanted to reintegrate to mainstream school. And some of their pupils' decisions remained constant, whereas for others, their decisions shifted over time, such as Sammy, who'd been set on returning to mainstream school, but became, really overwhelmed about the challenges or that may re-emerge if she was to transition back in. And there were varying influences on her decision, and she actually decided to stay at the PRU, despite the fact at the beginning of the process she'd been really keen. Oh, is that the little timer thing? She'd been really keen to transition back. So working towards a different future. Again, multiple outcomes and experiences for pupils. For Carter, he had a really positive transition and was kind of enabled to have a fresh start within his new school. But for others, there were kind of ongoing issues in relation to earlier things that had cropped up, in school life before the move. Some of these issues were reoccurring despite the change in context that had occurred. So really reflecting on how this approach had multiple outcomes, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Many people had different experiences, and I think just highlighting Michael's quote here, he reintegrated into a new school, but just after I'd gone to see him again, he'd just recently been in a fight and felt very hopeless about what his future looked like, and kind of referred to himself as just being a PRU kid and needing to go back there. So just highlighting some of the ongoing challenges, despite the fact that a new educational context had been provided. The main features of the managed move process that impact on young people's education, I won't go into those, but that was my thematic analysis that was conducted. So just moving on to implications quickly. So in terms of what managed moves mean, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of, they need to be redefined. At the moment, schools don't seem unclear about whether that, you know, it's a collaborative intervention, and through the research that didn't come out in pupils' accounts. You know, we need to prevent the confusion and navigation of this system that young people experience, and there needs to be a much clearer difference in highlighting you know, what's different about a managed move to an exclusion, further than just the guidance which says that there should be an agreement of everyone involved. You know, this doesn't just mean that a signature has been obtained. It really is about it being a collaborative and voluntary process that people sign up to. There also needs to be much more support into how to include the views of young people in the managed move process, linking to that idea of it being something collaborative. The number and reasons behind a managed move need to be centrally recorded. This currently is, you know, we have no sense of the number of managed moves that are happening nationally. And we also need to think a little bit more about the interim placement. Oh, I think that might mean that I need to finish. Whether that's, you know, an additional transition that we're putting in young people under. I do have another slide about EP implications, but I think, does that mean my time's up? Yeah, in terms of EPs being able to prioritise their role in working with pupils at risk of managed move. You know, the EPs should be consulted in thinking about whether a managed move may be in the best interests, utilising person-centred approaches if this approach is going to be enacted, and working with PRU so that pupils' vulnerabilities aren't exacerbated by their additional placements there. You know, they can support with the reintegration side of things in terms of using approaches such as VIG to help build relationships, and also thinking about schools implementing restorative justice practices so that pupils are being kept within their environment rather than experiencing the upheaval of going through the managed move process.